At 7:42 a.m. on February 18, 2013, the Coast Guard logged an automated distress ping from an unknown vessel drifting 54 miles off the coast of Bar Harbor, Maine. The signal lasted only 9 seconds. No voice transmission followed. No coordinates updated. Then the ocean went silent again. The vessel's identity would remain unanswered for 8 years, until an ice survey aircraft spotted something trapped between two massive formations off the Labrador Shelf. The question that haunted investigators from the first minute still stands. What happened to Daniel Mercer, a 42-year-old mechanic whose wife vanished on a winter cruise he never believed she boarded safely? The morning the ping appeared, most analysts dismissed it as interference. But Mercer had been filing inquiries for years, insisting the company behind the cruise line was hiding something. He tracked ship logs, weather records, and maintenance reports. He had spent more than he earned, lost jobs, and strained every relationship around him. He kept saying the same thing. If the ship didn't sink, then where is it? The discovery of the frozen vessel in 2021 forced agencies to reopen the case, and his question became impossible to ignore. The first team to approach the wreck reported a scene untouched since the day it disappeared. No scorch marks, no collision damage. Passenger decks suspended in ice as if sealed within a single moment. It contradicted every official explanation the company had provided, including their claim of mechanical failure and sudden flooding. Mercer flew to Maine within 24 hours, determined to see anything authorities would allow. He carried a binder filled with 8 years of notes, accusations, and unanswered requests. As investigators prepared to board the ship for the first time, one detail from the original distress ping reemerged. The audio file contained a faint background sound, 3 metallic impacts spaced evenly apart. No one had noticed it in 2013. Now it suggested something deliberate. Someone hit something 3 times. Daniel Mercer was 42 when investigators finally took his warning seriously, but his story started years earlier in Bangor, Maine. He was a brake and transmission specialist, the kind of mechanic who remembered every VIN and every noise a car made. He worked long weeks at a small shop off Hogan Road, came home to a rented duplex, and split his time between overtime and his wife, Laura. They had been married 15 years when Laura booked a discounted winter cruise through a company called Atlantic Horizon Cruises. The ship, the Northwind Star, left from Boston in early February. Laura told friends it was a reward for surviving another brutal Maine winter. Daniel later told investigators he had a bad feeling the moment he saw the ticket. He could not explain it with anything but dates and numbers, and no one listened then. On the night before she left, they argued about money. Daniel wanted to cancel the trip and pay down medical debt. Laura said the ticket was non-refundable and she needed a break more than he needed another spreadsheet. Security cameras later showed her boarding alone at Black Falcon Terminal with 1 suitcase and a backpack. She texted him a photo from the departure lounge at 4:11 p.m. on February 7, 2013, and then nothing. Their close circle knew Daniel as intense, but loyal. After she disappeared, that intensity hardened into obsession. He set up a home office in what used to be their spare bedroom. He pinned ship diagrams, weather charts, and insurance filings to the walls. He recorded every customer service call with Atlantic Horizon and stored each file by date and time. Friends stopped visiting. His adult daughter from a previous relationship moved out after 1 year of listening to the same theories. If you want more long-form investigations like this, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next case. It tells platforms that real cold cases matter more than rumors and quick headlines. By the time the unknown distress ping flashed across a Coast Guard monitor, Daniel had already called their office 96 times. Investigators now had to decide whether he was a grieving husband who could not let go, or the only person who had understood the danger from the start. On February 7, 2013, Laura Mercer arrived at the Black Falcon Cruise Terminal in Boston at 2:56 p.m. Security footage shows her stepping out of a shuttle van, rolling 1 medium suitcase, carrying a Navy backpack. She checked in at 3:18 p.m., cleared security at 3:29 p.m., and scanned her boarding pass at 3:41 p.m. Investigators later confirmed each step through terminal logs and camera timestamps. At 3:37 p.m., phone records show a 2-minute call to Daniel. He was at the shop, on another line, and let it go to voicemail. She left a short message. She told him the ship looked bigger than the photos and promised to call again after the safety drill. Passengers later told investigators that the first hours on the Northwind Star felt normal. Muster stations, life jacket demonstrations, bar promotions on the pool deck. Laura appears in the background of a fellow passenger's video at 5:12 p.m., standing near the rail, holding a paper cup. At 6:04 p.m., she texted a co-worker from the hospital in Bangor. She wrote that the ship was freezing inside and that the crew seemed stressed out for no reason. That co-worker kept the message on her phone for years. Laura had signed up for a continuing education seminar for critical care nurses held in one of the conference rooms on Deck 5. Attendance sheets from the first full day at sea list her name and signature at 9:02 a.m. on February 8th. Slides from the presenter later recovered from a laptop show her sitting in the second row. She was engaged, taking notes, participating in case discussions. Everything on paper suggested a routine trip. The first odd entry appears in her pocket planner, found years later in her cabin desk. Under February 9th, she wrote 3 short lines. Crew hallway near comms. Young officer, name tag E. Cole. Watching everyone. Argument with captain? Check later. That officer, now identified as Communications Officer Evan Cole, would become central to the investigation. Laura sent one more text to Daniel that night at 8:19 p.m. She said the ocean looked darker than she expected and asked if he had listened to her first voicemail yet. He never replied before the Northwind Star left cell range and vanished from every public map. On February 10th, 2013, the Northwind Star stopped talking to the world. At 6:02 a.m., its automatic identification system sent a final position update east of Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. At 6:11 a.m., satellite phone records show a failed outgoing call from the ship's bridge to Atlantic Horizon's operations center in Miami. No one answered, and no one tried to call back. After 6:15 a.m., there were no more signals that authorities could see. The company did not notify the Coast Guard that anything was wrong. Internal emails later obtained by investigators show a very different reaction inside Atlantic Horizon. At 9:23 a.m., an operations manager wrote that the Northwind Star had dropped off tracking for 3 hours. He logged the anomaly and suggested contacting the captain. At 10:04 a.m., a senior executive replied that the ship's older equipment often glitched. He ordered staff to avoid unnecessary alarm and told them to wait. They marked the vessel as likely communications outage and took no further action that day. Families did not know any of this. For them, the first sign of a problem was silence. Laura's friends from the seminar noticed she did not show up for the afternoon session. They assumed she was seasick or at the spa. By the time the Northwind Star missed its scheduled check-in near St. John's, Newfoundland, Atlantic Horizon still had not contacted authorities. The Coast Guard in Boston finally learned of the missing ship 38 hours after the last confirmed position. A relative of another passenger called their public line in a panic. Search aircraft and cutters were deployed across thousands of square miles of open water. They found nothing. No oil slick. No debris field. No life rafts. Atlantic Horizon issued a press release describing a probable catastrophic systems failure in severe winter conditions. The statement blamed rough seas, freezing spray, and outdated onboard systems. Weather records did show rough seas and freezing spray that week. They did not show the kind of storm that usually sinks a cruise ship. Back in Bangor, Daniel kept replaying one detail that no one else focused on. The ship had reported good weather and calm operations less than 12 hours before it vanished from every official screen. He printed the last weather report and pinned it beside the Atlantic Horizon press release. The numbers did not match the story. If the weather could not explain the silence, something human would have to. When the frozen cruise ship was finally identified as the Northwind Star in March 2021, the first serious anomalies appeared on screens, not on ice. Analysts at the Coast Guard Operations Systems Center pulled the ship's archive track from 2013 and overlaid it with the position of the wreck. The difference was not a minor drift. The vessel had traveled hundreds of miles north of its approved winter route, directly toward a region that carried ice warnings that week. There was no record of any order approving that deviation. Navigation logs from the original voyage, backed up by the ship's satellite tracking system, showed a series of sharp heading changes during the last 12 hours of contact. Each change required manual input at the bridge. Automatic route optimization could not explain it. At 4:06 a.m., the track shows the Northwind Star turning on a bearing that moved it away from warmer water and into colder seas. 10 minutes later, its speed dropped without any storm data to support a slowdown. Once the wreck was confirmed, technicians went back to the 9-second distress ping recorded on February 18, 2013. The file had been labeled incomplete and irrelevant. Using updated audio tools, they stripped out background noise. Under the static, they found 3 clear metallic impacts spaced exactly 1 second apart. No voice, no alarm tones, just those impacts and a short burst of electrical interference. The timestamp matched the last manual course change before all systems went quiet. An internal memorandum drafted that week by a Coast Guard investigator flagged the pattern as inconsistent with unplanned system failure. It noted that the Northwind Star had sailed into a known ice advisory zone, while company records still listed it on a southern track. Atlantic Horizon continued to tell families the ship likely sank in heavy weather south of Newfoundland. The government's own plots now placed it climbing steadily north toward the ice shelf where it was found. Daniel Mercer eventually obtained a redacted copy of that memo through a Freedom of Information Act request. One phrase stayed with him as he read it over and over: possible deliberate degradation of navigational and communications capability. If the ship's systems were destroyed on purpose, then someone on board had turned Laura's vacation into a controlled disappearance. The first boarding of the Northwind Star took place on March 22, 2021, at 7:15 a.m. local time. A joint American and Canadian team used a small ice-capable vessel to reach the gap between the two pressure ridges. They secured temporary ladders to a service deck on the starboard side. Helmet cameras recorded every step for later review. From the first frames, it was clear the ship had not broken apart or burned. Inside, investigators found every surface coated in ice. Deck chairs, drink carts, and luggage were frozen in place. Hallway lights were dead, but emergency strobes still hung from the ceilings on broken wires. Adult passengers lay where they had collapsed. Some were seated against walls, others in doorways, many grouped near stairwells and closed fire doors. There were no signs of looting, fire, or impact. Clothing and jewelry remained on the bodies. Forensic teams mapped each deck with laser scanners. They tagged and numbered more than 300 bodies over 4 days. They noted that most victims had been moving toward assembly points or medical areas when they froze. Only a small number were found in their assigned cabins. That detail directly contradicted Atlantic Horizon's early claim that passengers had likely been caught unaware in their staterooms during a sudden disaster. On Deck 4, near the entrance to the medical center, they found one woman in jeans and a sweater, one hand braced against the bulkhead, the other partially extended toward the sealed door. She wore a hospital conference badge with the name Laura Mercer, RN, Bangor Regional. Her wedding band remained on her left hand. A shallow injury above her right eyebrow had bled and then frozen in a thin arc along her temple. There were no defensive wounds, no obvious signs of a fall from height. Dental records and fingerprints confirmed her identity within 48 hours. Daniel received the call in Bangor and flew to a secure facility in Halifax to complete formal recognition. For the first time in 8 years, Laura's status moved from missing to deceased, remains recovered. Her position on the ship raised a new question that no one in authority could answer. Why had a passenger from Deck 7 died reaching for the medical bay door on Deck 4? Investigators had no one to interview from the Northwind Star. Every adult on board was recovered dead. To understand what happened in the last hours, they turned to what the ship itself had recorded. In the medical office, next to the frozen body of the ship's doctor, they found a worn spiral notebook, still legible once the ice melted away in a lab. The doctor was identified as Henry Larson, 53, a contract physician from Portland, Maine. His last entries were dated February 10, 2013. Earlier pages dealt with routine seasickness, minor injuries, and the seminar group of critical care nurses, including Laura Mercer. The tone shifted 3 days into the voyage. He wrote that a junior communications officer, Evan Cole, had been spending time in crew-only hallways near sensitive equipment, far from his assigned station. Larson noted that Cole's employee badge did not match the name printed on a photocopied license he briefly saw in the crew lounge. On the engineering deck, search teams recovered a second notebook wedged behind a control console. It belonged to Chief Engineer Carla Dominguez. Her notes showed unexplained drops in fuel pressure and repeated overrides of safety interlocks traced back to a terminal in the communications room. She wrote that she suspected human interference, not malfunction. Her final line ended mid-sentence. The most detailed record came from the ship's internal paging system. Unlike voice calls, short text alerts between departments were stored on a separate server. Digital forensics staff pulled a series of messages between Medic and a device assigned to Laura's cabin. At 1:42 a.m., Laura wrote that she had seen Cole striking equipment with a tool in a restricted passageway and that he had shoved her when she challenged him. At 1:49 a.m., Larson replied, instructing her to avoid him and remain in her room. At 2:07 a.m., she sent a final message saying passengers were collapsing from the cold in the hall and that she was heading to the medical bay to help because I know how to run TRIA. Those words were timestamped less than 30 minutes before the ship's last course change and the 9-second distress ping. The server records also showed something no one expected, a second user logging into Cole's account from a location that should have been impossible. The second login to Evan Cole's account came from thousands of miles away. Digital forensics staff traced the IP address to a network block registered to Atlantic Horizon's corporate office in Miami, Florida. The timestamp was 2:11 a.m. ship time on February 10, 2013, for minutes after Laura's last message to the medical bay and less than 1 hour before the Northwind Star dropped off all public tracking. According to crew rosters and immigration records, every Atlantic Horizon executive was on land that night. Inside the Coast Guard, the discovery split the investigative team. One group saw the pattern as evidence that someone on shore had accessed Cole's credentials to alter navigation or communications settings remotely. Another group argued that outdated system clocks, rerouted traffic, or simple logging errors could produce the same illusion. Their internal emails show the disagreement clearly. One senior officer wrote that the case showed indicators of coordinated sabotage. Another replied that it was reckless to accuse a major U.S. company without more. Atlantic Horizon pushed one explanation from the start. Their lawyers told families and regulators that Cole had gone rogue. They claimed he had falsified maintenance tickets, tampered with equipment for unknown reasons, and caused a series of failures that doomed the ship. They said they had been deceived, too, and emphasized his relatively recent hire. In their narrative, the story ended with one unstable employee and a tragic chain reaction in bad weather. Daniel Mercer saw something else. He obtained redacted correspondence between the Coast Guard and the company through multiple Freedom of Information Act requests. In one letter dated April 2013, Atlantic Horizon objected to a proposed inspection of their Miami servers, calling it disruptive and unnecessary. They stated that all relevant data from the Northwind Star had already been provided on backup tapes. Those tapes, when analyzed years later, showed gaps that lined up almost exactly with the period of the unauthorized login. By 2021, investigators had three competing theories: a lone saboteur on board, a catastrophic technical failure, or a coordinated action involving someone at the corporate office. Only one of those theories fit the numbers, the timing, and Laura's final messages. It raised a new possibility Daniel had feared for years, that the ship itself had been turned into a weapon against everyone on board. In the weeks after the wreck was identified, Daniel Mercer's focus shifted from the ice to the money. He hired a small law firm in Portland that specialized in maritime claims. They subpoenaed insurance filings and internal financial records related to the Northwind Star. One document stood out immediately. 6 months before the 2013 voyage, Atlantic Horizon had increased the ship's loss-at-sea coverage from $110 million to $320 million. The policy specified total constructive loss in open water as the primary trigger. Board minutes from August 2012, obtained later in discovery, showed senior executives discussing the Northwind Star as a non-performing asset with rising maintenance costs. One director suggested selling the vessel to an overseas buyer. Another argued that the resale market was weak. The meeting ended with a directive to explore alternative strategies for asset retirement and risk transfer. The minutes did not mention passengers or crew at all. A separate trail led investigators back to Evan Cole. His personnel file listed previous work with 3 different cruise companies. When federal agents contacted those firms, each responded that they had no record of him. A fingerprint comparison finally linked him to a man named Marcus Ellery, a former Navy electronics technician discharged in 2008 after an internal theft investigation. Under that name, he had consulted for a private security firm that advertised discreet, maritime risk solutions. Bank records tied Ellery to 2 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. In the 6 months before the Northwind Star sailed, those accounts received 4 wire transfers totaling $2,800,000. The sending institution was the same bank Atlantic Horizon used for corporate operations. The listed remitter was a shell company formed in Delaware 3 weeks before the first payment. When investigators traced the shell company's registration, they found a mailing address identical to Atlantic Horizon's Miami headquarters. The registered agent on the paperwork was an executive assistant to the company's vice president for fleet operations. That vice president sat in the August 2012 board meeting where the Northwind Star was labeled a problem ship. For Daniel, the pattern was no longer abstract. The money moved in the same direction as the ship. Federal prosecutors in Massachusetts opened a criminal inquiry into Atlantic Horizon 10 days after the Northwind Star was confirmed. A joint task force with the Coast Guard and FBI began presenting evidence to a grand jury in Boston. They focused on 3 people at the top of the company: CEO Richard Halpern, Chief Financial Officer Megan Dwyer, and Vice President for Fleet Operations Thomas Rudd. All 3 had signed off on the increased insurance coverage and the creation of the Delaware Shell Company. Agents executed search warrants at Atlantic Horizon's Miami headquarters in late April 2021. They seized hard drives, email archives, and backup tapes that the company had claimed to produce earlier. Digital forensic teams compared them with the tapes turned over in 2013. The new copies contained entire folders that had been missing during the original investigation. One chain of emails showed Rudd discussing options for controlled decommissioning of the Northwind Star, including non-traditional risk transfer mechanisms. Another contained a draft talking point instructing executives to characterize the disaster as sudden mechanical failure. Families of the victims, including Daniel Mercer, were allowed to address prosecutors in a closed meeting. Daniel laid out his timeline of unanswered calls and conflicting weather reports. He also described the paper trail tying corporate accounts to Marcus Ellery's offshore funds. According to people in the room, several jurors asked follow-up questions directly to him, an unusual step at that stage. On June 3, 2021, the grand jury returned a sealed indictment. 2 weeks later, federal agents arrested Halpern at his home in Coral Gables. They picked up Dwyer at a vacation property in Naples. They detained Rudd as he arrived at Miami International Airport with a one-way ticket to Lisbon. They were charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, insurance fraud, and destruction of maritime safety equipment. A separate count alleged they had knowingly placed passengers and crew in lethal danger. If convicted on all counts, each faced a potential sentence measured in decades, not years. From his small house in Bangor, Daniel watched the first court appearance live-streamed on a news site. The 3 executives pleaded not guilty and stared straight into the camera. None of them looked surprised that the Northwind Star had been found at all. The trial of Atlantic Horizon's leadership began on March 7, 2022, in federal court in Boston. A jury of 12 heard opening statements outlining a scheme that prosecutors said turned the Northwind Star into a disposable asset. Halpern, Dwyer, and Rudd faced counts of wire fraud, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and knowingly endangering passengers and crew. Murder charges were never filed, but the language in the indictment was clear about the deadly outcome. Prosecutors built their case with documents instead of emotion. They walked the jury through the August 2012 board minutes, the sudden tripling of loss at sea coverage, and the creation of the Delaware Shell Company that funneled money to Marcus Ellery. They showed bank records from the Cayman Islands, linking those transfers to Ellery's accounts. Then they played the 9-second distress ping and introduced the technical report highlighting the 3 metallic strikes and the suspicious second login to Evan Cole's credentials from Miami. Coast Guard investigators testified about the ship's course change into the ice advisory zone. Digital forensic analysts explained how deleted folders on Atlantic Horizon's backup tapes matched the missing period around the unauthorized login. A maritime safety expert told the jury that disabling communication and sabotaging lifeboat systems, if proven, could only be described as deliberate. The most detailed testimony came from the notebooks and logs recovered on board. An evidence technician read passages from Dr. Henry Larson's spiral notebook about his concerns with Cole's identity. Another described Chief Engineer Carla Dominguez's handwritten notes on manipulated fuel systems and bypassed interlocks. A specialist from the paging system vendor read Laura Mercer's final messages, including her report that she had seen Cole striking equipment and her decision to head for the medical bay. Daniel took the stand mid-trial. He walked the jury through his 8 years of records, his calls, his spreadsheets, and the patterns he saw in the company's statements. The defense tried to paint him as obsessed and unreliable. He responded with dates, call logs, and copies of letters Atlantic Horizon sent him, promising transparency while withholding key data. The defense argued that Ellery had acted alone, twisting a legitimate security contract into something criminal. They claimed the executives believed they were paying for risk assessments and salvage planning, not sabotage. But under cross-examination, Rudd had to read aloud an email he had written in 2012, telling Dwyer that insurance would more than cover a total loss, and that the Northwind Star was worth more retired than repaired. On April 19, 2022, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all fraud and conspiracy counts. They acquitted on the charge that directly alleged intentional endangerment, saying the evidence did not meet the legal standard for that count. The judge later sentenced Halpern to 30 years, Dwyer to 24, and Rudd to 27, noting that their decisions had set in motion a chain of events that made disaster not just possible, but profitable. For the families, the verdict answered one question and opened another, because criminal convictions did not explain how the same pattern might already exist on other ships. By the time sentences were handed down in April 2022, Atlantic Horizon barely existed as a company. Creditors had moved to seize its remaining ships. Civil attorneys representing the Northwind Star families filed a wave of wrongful death suits. Within months, the corporation entered bankruptcy, and a victims' compensation fund was created using what was left of its assets and insurance recovery. The amounts could never match the loss, but they gave families standing and leverage. Regulators moved next. The National Transportation Safety Board and the Coast Guard held joint hearings in Washington, D.C., on systemic failures exposed by the case. Experts testified about gaps in oversight, aging equipment exemptions, and the ease with which corporate officers had hidden critical data behind shell companies and partial disclosures. New rules were drafted requiring real-time tracking backups, mandatory off-site data mirrors, and stricter reporting when a ship deviated from its planned route. Officials described the Northwind Star as a turning point for corporate accountability at sea. For the Mercer family, closure looked different. Laura was buried in Bangor in a small cemetery not far from the hospital where she had worked. The headstone listed both her dates and the date her body was recovered. Daniel dismantled the wall of maps and charts in his spare room, but kept one binder, the one he used in court. He returned to work part-time at the garage, then began speaking occasionally at maritime safety conferences when asked. He always brought copies of Laura's final messages to the medical bay. Some relatives of other victims remained unsatisfied. They pointed out that only 3 executives had faced trial, while dozens of managers had approved or ignored decisions that made the disaster possible. Congressional staff reports quietly acknowledged that evidence of similar insurance structures existed at other companies, though not at the same scale. The name Northwind Star became shorthand in industry discussions for what could happen when profit and risk management crossed a line. The wreck itself stayed locked in ice, pending further study and legal proceedings over salvage rights. Researchers wanted to learn more from its preserved systems. Families argued it should be left alone as a grave. Daniel visited the site once, on a sanctioned relative's flight, looking down at the white shape trapped between pressure ridges. Authorities had answered the question of who benefited from the ship's disappearance, but one detail still sat unresolved in the final case file. The identity of the Miami network user who logged into Evan Cole's account that night has never been confirmed.